Hey, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our gang in Atlantic County and up in Essex County. We're happy to be with you tonight. We have a very full agenda this evening. So as we have been doing, the last 5 minutes of the lecture will be for questions. So we're going to ask people to write their questions on an index card, and we'll pass them up to the front of the room here in New Brunswick. And we'll also take questions on the chat box from our remote locations. So since we do have such a full agenda, we won't take a formal break during the program, but if any point you need to get up and stretch or use the restrooms, please feel free to do so. So we're happy to have our first speaker with us this evening is Dr. Brian Shilling, and Brian is the director of Rutgers Cooperative Extension, and Brian was also our extension specialist in farm policy, and he's done a lot of work educating legislators, municipalities, farmers. He's worked a lot with New Jersey Farm Bureau on right to farm issues, so we're glad to have you with us this evening, Brian.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to be out of my administrative role and be with you tonight in more of a professor role. One thing I'll share with you is I've been a member of what's known as the State Agriculture Development Committee for about 13 years. That's the agency in Trenton that's in but not of. It's a separate executive agency within state government, but it's really linked to the State Department of Agriculture. And that unit oversees 2 of the 3 critical programs that are probably the cornerstones of agricultural retention and development in the state. One is farmland preservation, which you'd likely know. One is what we'll discuss tonight, which is right to farm, which are strong, very strong legal protections for farming. And the third is a policy that goes back to the 1950s and 60s, known as farmland assessment. So right to farm and farmland preservation were actually passed in 1983 concurrently. They were linked. The legislature would not pass one without the other. And what's very interesting, I can't say it as articulately as the authors did, but in the 1970s there was a report called the Blueprint Commission on the Future of Agriculture in New Jersey. It really laid a roadmap to what ultimately became our farm policies that I just mentioned. In it, it said, you know, we've got a lot of challenges here. We've been losing farms for various reasons, development pressures, all these types of things. And it said we need to approach this idea of ag retention with a 2-headed spear. One point of the spear has to look at the physical problem of losing land. Well, that led to farmland preservation. And the other point of it has to look at the problem that we create for ourselves in terms of regulation, nuisance complaints, effectively what happens when incompatible uses come together. If you're farming next to a farmer, they know you do these things like farm early in the morning and late at night, apply pesticides or chemicals or fertilizer or make dust, right? But what about new neighbors that are residential? So with full acknowledgement and appreciation of staff at the State Ag Development Committee, what I'd like to do is share with you tonight what I think is a very good resource document that's on the screen. And with your indulgence, I'm going to scroll through and skip some things, but this will be made available to you electronically, and I'll jump to the end with some resources. But what I want to do is give you at least a basic familiarity with what right to farm is. Okay, so right to farm is very powerful because in the state of New Jersey, we're what's called a home rule state. For those of you who might not know what that means, it means that local governments are given very substantial powers to regulate land use. To have a state entity come in and tell a locality, a municipality, we're going to preempt your local ordinances is a very, very powerful protection that can be extended to farmers. And I'll tell you the criteria for getting that protection and the circumstances under which you'll get that and receive that protection. But the first part of right to farm is to protect a responsible farmer from excessive local regulation. The other part of it is to protect a farmer who is engaged in normal agricultural practices from a neighbor that might come in and all of a sudden take exception to certain agricultural practices that they perceive to be a nuisance. All right, anyone know what this is? That's my friend Ronnie Lee's farm, as it turns out. I've used this picture a number of times. What stands out to you? He's the donut hole. He's surrounded on all sides by residential development. Now, we don't have time enough tonight to get into this deeply, but I often ask people, is this an advantage or a disadvantage, a strength, a weakness, a threat, an opportunity? And whatever you answer, you're correct.
They're giving us feedback that they can't hear you when you turn toward the screen.
Okay.
Yeah, so just,
Excuse me, folks. I'm sorry for that.
there you go. There you go. Should be better.
Okay. Wardrobe issues. So basically, the answer is both. It's advantage, disadvantage. So in this context, you can imagine you've got multiple neighbors around you that could conceivably raise a legal challenge against you, file a nuisance complaint. So that's why right to farm is so important. So let me just give you an understanding that this is a very brief overview. This is a very complicated issue. So I'll talk a little bit about what it is, process, and where to turn to, importantly, for more information that might be customized to your needs. So first off, right to farm can do a few things. If we find ourselves in a conflict as a farm with the municipality or the neighbor, right, there is a formal complaint process that involves going to what's called the County Agriculture Development Board. So we have 21 counties in the state of New Jersey. With the exception of Hudson County, Essex County, and Union County, we have what we call in shorthand CADBs, County Agriculture Development Boards, in all of those counties. The state equivalent is a committee I mentioned earlier, the State Agriculture Development Committee. So what's important here, and I'm going to skim over it very quickly, but case law is very specific. If you are going to register a complaint with a farm, the CADB has jurisdiction. You as a neighbor, you as a municipality would have to file that complaint with the CADB, not in a court. It's a jurisdiction issue. Another very powerful alternative available to you is the fact that if you're sitting there contemplating developing that CSA that I heard you reference earlier, or getting engaged in a certain activity, maybe it's a farm market or an agritourism venture, or raising animals, or doing certain agricultural practices, you may want to go to the CADB and say, listen, this is what I'm thinking about doing. Could you give me a determination? Could you give me what's called an SSAMP in the jargon world, a site-specific agriculture management practice, which is essentially a determination from the County Ag Development Board, from now on let's call it a CADB, that says, yes, we find that you are engaged in normal agricultural management practices and that you will basically be protected under the right to farm if there is a concern expressed by the municipality or a neighbor. All right? So you can proactively go out and try to get an advanced determination whether or not you'll be effectively protected. Very advisable if you can. All right? So if you find yourself in a conflict with a neighbor or a municipality, both parties have already lost, right? So now we're trying to figure out who's going to win this fight. Another option I'm going to just touch on very briefly is under the SADC, State Ag Development Committee, they offer a free service, which is an agricultural mediation program. So if you, neighbor, and I, farmer, are at odds over something, we can enter into this voluntary process of mediation. And the idea, and it's confidential, it's free, and we have a roster of trained mediators that we approve annually that provide this service to you. And the idea here is oftentimes when there's conflict, what I find is we fight over the things that we disagree about, but we probably have a fairly generous amount of commonality between us. It's just we're choosing to fight over something, maybe at the margin. So what we're trying to find is this nice, healthy middle spot where maybe you give a little and I give a little and we both walk away happy and we don't have to go through a legal process with one another. Okay, so as I said, let's get into right to farm. Let's say that it's a nuisance complaint. You're making dust and you have the audacity to farm on a Saturday morning at the obscene hour of 10:30 in the morning. All right? I object. I have an attorney. I'm going to sue you. Well, it's very clear, as I said, that the CADB has jurisdiction. So that complaint has to be filed. Now, if, as is often the case, there is not proper procedure and somebody goes to file in a court, the SADC will file a letter and say, time out, back up a little bit. This is a right to farm dispute. It needs to be initially filed with the CADB. Okay? So we've established that it's a jurisdiction issue. And let me just, in the interest of your time and trying to maximize the value of our time together, jump into, so what are the eligibility criteria? So the first thing is that the CADB needs to determine that you are a commercial farm, which is defined in statute. NJSA is basically New Jersey statutes annotated. You could look this up. I'm giving you the non-legalese version of this, which is a nice summary. If you have a farm that is over 5 acres in size, 5 acres or more in size, you need to generate and document that you are producing $2,500 or more in agricultural sales, and also satisfy the criteria for farmland assessment. If you are smaller than that, if you are under 5 acres of size and otherwise meet the conditions for farmland assessment, that's a tax program basically, you have to generate and document sales of at least $50,000, all right? So small farms have to generate a higher agricultural sales volume. Now, more recently, the beekeeping community was working to try to clarify where it fits in this, and there is actually consideration. It appears we're still having some difficulty on the audio. Okay, I'll hold it like this if it's more appropriate. So there is also some provisions to allow beekeepers who don't have extensive acres, they really probably enumerate how big their operation is based on the number of hives. So there's some criteria there. All right, so the second condition to consider is there's a location provision that considers zoning. So another consideration the CADB will have is whether your farm was located in an area that as of the end of 1997 or thereafter, agriculture was allowed as a permitted use, or the operation itself existed prior to July 2 of 98. All right? These are things what the CADB will determine. And again, a lot of this is really legal stuff in statute, and I'm going to come to a point later in the talk, I'll give you a glimpse at it. Talk to your CADB, talk to your SADC with questions. Don't get too wrapped up in all the legal stuff. But also, you need to basically be engaged in an activity that the statute or regulation acknowledges is something that can be protected. All right? And I'll get into that in a moment. So whether you're a new farm starting out, whether you're farming on just a few acres, doing it in an urban area, a rural area, these basic criteria are the same. All right? So I'm going to pass over this. Again, this whole resource is going to be made available to you. I'm trying to pull out some of the real highlights. All right. So what are some of the activities that are recognized in statute as being protected? Here they are. You have the right to produce crops or raise livestock, process your agricultural output. You can operate a farm market if you're selling your products. And again, there's a lot of detail here. That's why every case is so specific. You really need to speak to your CADB. All right? Manage your soil health, control pests, deer fencing. We've had cases where I'm looking at a beautiful farm over there and you have the nerve to put up a deer fence. It's obstructing my view. Take it down. I'm not laughing. This is real stuff, right? So the farmer has the right to control wildlife damaging his or her crop. So obviously that case would be found in favor of the farmer. Again, this is the nature of what happens here sometimes when you have people that don't understand agriculture living in proximity. So here's a number of other things. I would like to draw your attention. You have the right to engage in certain agricultural, let's call them agritourism activities that relate to educational, recreational things, but relate to the marketing of your farm product. That's a key thing. If you are doing things that are effectively drawing people to help you market your product, you have a corn maze, you have a hayride, something that helps you market your product, you can receive protections for these. If you want to put a Ferris wheel up and start having, a theme park, no, we're not going to protect that. Just moving on quickly, also more recently, generating power for your farm, no more than 10% of your annual usage of energy on your farm based on solar, wind, or biomass, etc. All right? So let me tell you what you will not get away with. You must comply with applicable state and federal laws. A big one would be, for example, stormwater management. You build a structure, you're probably going to have a stormwater management issue. UCC, construction codes, etc. All right? So I'm going to move quickly, and I do apologize, but these are kind of rapid fire types of sessions together. Number 5, you cannot pose a direct threat to public health or safety. All right? What that means is, what are we doing here? I don't know why there's a picture of goats, but if you are creating an unsafe traffic situation, if you are doing something that otherwise potentially could harm people, you will not be protected. And finally, you need to demonstrate that you are conforming to accepted agricultural management practices. So if I am doing things that are somehow reckless or just not customary, I'm not taking the customary care that a responsible farmer would take, you will not get protected. So these are defined in statute, and some include beekeeping, managing, as Dr. Heckman will discuss, with poultry, manure application. I would like to draw your attention onto the right side as you're taking this in, on-farm direct marketing, all right? So in many cases, having direct marketing means changing local traffic patterns for very, destination-oriented farms. So there are specific what we call ag management practices that if you're going to do a direct market, you should be familiar with in terms of where are the boundaries that you have to stay within in order to receive these protections. All right? So this was, again, a very, rapid-fire approach, but let me emphasize just a couple things. All right? Case law is unambiguous. You have the right to farm, but there's a balancing test. We also have to consider other public interests, all right? The language in court in case law is that right to farm does not allow you, the farmer, carte blanche. Basically, the ability and the right to do whatever you want to do. There's got to be these balancing between the needs and interests of the agriculture industry as well as the needs and interests of the public and the municipalities. All right? So what I'd like to do in our last minute together is basically, again, reiterate that this is a document that was put together by the SADC, which will be made available to you. There are a number of very good resources that are really presented in lay language. In other words, really interpreting the legalese into things that are much more accessible. So you'll have these at your disposal. I would invite you to look at some of these resources that are, kind of an introduction to right to farm, as well as ag mediation. So with that, I'll end, and if there is an opportunity for a question, if we're not too late, I'm happy to take one.
Okay. Set
Looks like we have some people talking. Let's see if there are questions. No, just a mic comment. If they have questions, they'll pop up there.
Okay. So okay. So a few quick questions here. All right, so one is about ownership of the property. So it is actually the farming activity that we would receive right to farm for. So let me just take a quick glance at these questions. Oof, that's a tough one. We're going to pretend we didn't get that. The question was about eminent domain, basically the power that the municipality has to take land for compensation for a higher public use. That's sometimes known as a taking or eminent domain. That is complicated. That is not protecting a agricultural practice. So where we do have certain protections against eminent domain is in the case of farmland preservation. So farmland preservation means effectively that the state, county, nonprofit, or a combination have effectively purchased an interest in your property. So they have a legal interest in your property. As such, they would be party to that kind of action, and preservation would offer some level of protection against eminent domain. I do not see right to farm as a protection against eminent domain. To meet the criteria for a commercial farm, can the value of donated produce be included? I need to get, whoever asked that question, that's a good question. I will have to look into that. Nick, do you know, as somebody who would be involved, I don't believe the value of donated products. You need to customarily demonstrate the value of products sold. I do not believe donated value would count.
I believe that's correct.
Yeah. And I'm mixing a case that I once heard. Yeah. You need to demonstrate receipts. Will the CADB or SADC be able to help determine when activities we can do as a farm under preserved, what activities we can do as a farm under preserved farmland? Okay. Whoa, boy. Weddings and agritourism. Okay. So, yes. So, we have been in this business of right to farm and farmland preservation since 1983. This question is a very good one because what it does is draws the two programs together, which I told you were joined at the hip upon passage. But they are two separate programs. If you are not eligible for right to farm, it doesn't mean you can't do it. It means you will not have this higher level of legal protection against nuisance or excessive regulation. Over here, when you preserve your land, you have now invited a public interest in your land in exchange for compensation, what we would often call an easement payment. You want to preserve 100 acres? We'll go through a process. You will get a check, and your land will now be preserved, and we, the SADC, the state, will have a legal obligation to make sure that the terms of that easement are adhered to in perpetuity, presumably forever. The two programs are separate, so no. Right to farm does not dictate what activities you can or cannot do on a preserved farm. Your deed of easement does. This is a highly complicated and evolving area because when we passed farmland preservation in 1983, farming looked a certain way. 2020, farming looks different. So certain things have to be interpreted in the context of the current agricultural industry. Weddings is a challenging issue. And I think it's not appropriate for me to get too wrapped up in this giving my public opinion because this is an evolving area. It's very difficult. We are now determining and constantly, month after month, the SADC has to make these hard determinations. Is this compliant with the deed of easement? Is it a violation of the deed of easement? Are you engaged in an activity that is an agricultural activity? Or is it something that's gone a little bit too far? Is a wedding an agritourism event, or is it a non-agricultural event? You want to know the answer?
They could plant seeds.
What's that?
They could plant seeds as part of the wedding.
Oh, you're even making it more complicated.
Is the deed of easement the same? Is it the standard deed of easement, or are
This-
they evolving as well?
The standard deed of easement is the same, but ultimately, we could look a little different because there are provisions or you could declare a non-agricultural use and grandfather it. So fundamentally, the deed of easement terms are similar, but you might accept out a certain portion of your farm, and I know we're running out of time, so we need to move on.
We just have two questions in the chat box that maybe we could maybe we could answer while we're
Sure, let's
switching over.
switch over, and I'll step out of the way.
Up and,
I'm sorry, I don't have my glasses on, but it
oh,
looks
yeah.
to be a
One
question about
was,
urban.
with the size of less
Okay.
than 5 acres, and the other question was about indoor farming. Would that come under
Okay.
right to farm?
So greenhouse production, as an example, yes. Indoor cultivation would be. Now, the question about, here, Joe, come on over. The 5-acre provision I addressed earlier in the eligibility, if you have under 5 acres, you need to demonstrate sales of over $50,000 annually in order to qualify. Okay. Joe, would you care to take over?
Well, we're done with questions, and tell me what time I need to finish up.
Yep.
I'll try to
So we need to